that level? Well, first tell me, what's the IV? We're talking about clients' preferences during prayer and counseling. So what was the primary independent variable for this study? Their prayer preference, right? And what were the options? What could they choose? What was the option A? Prayer in session with their therapist. Right? That they wanted to pray with their therapist. What was option B?
By yourself.
They wanted to pray on their own outside of therapy, right? So they didn't want to pray with their therapist or during session, but they wanted to be encouraged by their therapist to pray outside of their session with regard to whatever it was they were working on. And what was option C? No prayer, right? I do not want prayer integrated into my therapy at all. I don't want it in my session. I don't want it out of my session. I want to talk about prayer as part of my therapy in any way. Okay? So people got to choose, right? Pretty clearly, this is not a manipulated variable, right? People very clearly got to choose which category they were in. So that makes this what? Subject variable. What are the implications of it being a subject variable? When you have subject variable, what does that mean? Lots of little alarm bells should be going. That's right, we're talking about pre-existing groups, right? Can't be manipulated by the researcher, can't do random assignment. What does that mean? That it's quasi-experimental? What else? What about the claims the researchers are going to be able to make? Only association claims. We can't make causal claims. They can't say that the category someone falls in causes anything, right? Or that anything caused them to be in those categories. So no causal claims. Another thing, we're not making causal claims. We're talking quasi-experimental. It means we will not be able to evaluate this study in terms of what? Internal validity. That's right, there is no internal validity in this study because we only have internal validity when we're talking about causal claims. So as soon as we know that this primary independent variable is a subject variable, all those things should be popping up in your head. Okay? These are pre-existing groups. We're not talking manipulation, we're talking selection. We're talking association claims, it's quasi-experimental, no internal validity. Right? Internal validity is not relevant. All of these things should be popping up in your head. And the reason that we're reading the articles, well, the articles kind of have three purposes. First purpose is to give you practice reading articles, getting used to it, because we're getting closer and closer to the time where you're going to be writing, and you need to be comfortable with articles and be able to kind of hack your way through them and feel like they're a little bit familiar. Second is to give you some experience reading about how researchers talk about and use the designs and statistics we're talking about. And third is to give you some time to work on practice problems. Because we need to have a break in between so you have some days where you can work on practice problems and come see me and come to office hours and stuff like that. So we're getting ready for our writing unit, but also this is meant to give you a little bit of a break, just an application break where we can relax a little bit and you're not being drilled to death on, and now what do we do, and now what do we do, and now what do we do, because there's a lot of that in that part. Okay, so we're talking about how people may or may not want to integrate prayer into their therapy. Now why might someone want to do that anyway? Hey, why? Why would prayer play any part? Or religiosity or spirituality play any part in counseling? Why would you want that? Why would you even ask this question? Give who hope? The researchers? Any hope? The client. Okay. So people's religious beliefs might give them hope. Okay. What else?
Sometimes counseling isn't voluntary.
Sometimes counseling isn't involuntary. True. True. Many teenagers would make that claim, I think. Right? Sometimes counseling is involuntary. So why would prayer play a part in that then? Like maybe
because for it to be beneficial, it should so appeal to the client. it.
Okay, so sometimes they might be there not necessarily because they want to, because they have to be there, and if religion and prayer is an important part of a person's life, then that may make it more palatable, more tolerable. Or vice versa. If they're there and they don't like it, they don't want to have prayer forced down their throat.
They won't take it seriously.
That's right. If you're telling me that this is all about, right, so we're trying to figure out how do we integrate those two things, because what kind of things does religion or spiritual belief, what do they do for people that might be helpful in therapy? I mean, you're a bunch of psych majors, right? Some of you might be thinking about going into clinical work, counseling work, social work. Why might a client be interested in having or not having prayer?
They don't have like introspection.
Introspection, okay, so religion gives you some
Like time to like when you pray, it's like kind of reflecting on your like actions every day, and, like your internal and external life kind of combining.
okay, and that could be helpful in a therapy session, okay?
I was going to say from the clinician's perspective, it might have some sort of a placebo effect. I don't know. Like,
How's that?
like if you're praying for whatever you're in counseling for, and then, I don't, like, you know how when you take placebo, you think it's working, and then mentally it's, I don't know how to
Well, so
explain it.
if someone has faith,
Right.
and they
There's
pray
like
for
faith
strength,
in the
and they,
placebo
well, it's a placebo if it's not really doing anything, but if your
Right.
faith is doing something for you, and for
Right.
some people, faith is a very powerful force in their lives, right? Their faith gives them strength in times of difficulty, it gives them hope, it makes them feel like they're not alone, it makes them feel like somebody with a lot of power and influence has a greater plan for them, and that things are going to be okay, and that they just need to work through it. So sometimes you can see how having something like that in your life might be helpful if you're going through a difficult time and you're in therapy. If that's something that's important to you, then integrating religion or spirituality into your therapy might actually might be a supportive mechanism, right? It might help your therapy work better for you. The same vein, if that's something that's not important to you, integrating it, if the therapist has strong religious or spiritual beliefs, and that person integrates prayer into the therapy, and that's something that you're not into, that may actually cause a problem, right? Because the person may feel like you're trying to force your belief system on them, and that might not work either, right? So we're thinking about how do we integrate things that are important to our clients in with their therapy to get an effective result, right? That's what a therapist should want to do, I think. So one possibility is that religion could be important, and we often don't talk about religion in a scientific context. People think that they're mutually exclusive, but they're not, right? I mean, they're just different ways to explain phenomena. And there are some things that someone might go to therapy for that you're not going to be able to explain scientifically. And so, religion may play a meaningful part for some people. All right, so we talked about, number 2, what the independent variable was, that it's a between subject variable, that it's a subject variable, right? Let's talk about number 3. Number 3 says, in a study on independent groups, it's typically considered very important to establish that the groups being compared are similar to one another in demographic terms and have homogeneity of variance in statistical terms before any analysis is performed. In this study, however, the researchers didn't do any of this. Why not? More specifically, what was it about the study's goals that made creating similar groups unnecessary or extremely difficult? Why did they need to do that? And I've been harping on that since the first day. One thing with between subject study is creating groups that are similar to compare. And here they're just throwing that all out the window. Why? I know the answer. I'm just going to sit here till you know.
Because it's based on something that's subjective. I mean, is this a subject variable?
Well, okay, good question. Is it because it's a subject variable? Is it possible to have a subject variable and to try and make the groups as similar as possible anyway? So say I wanted to have a subject variable that was race and ethnicity. I want to have people who identified as white, and people who identified as black, and people who identified as Hispanic, and people who identified as Asian. Would it be possible for me to create groups that were as similar as I could make them, even though that was a subject variable?
You could restrict age.
I could restrict age. What else could I do? I could make sure they were similar in terms of age. What else?
Sample size.
Sample size.
Education level.
Gender, sex, education level,
Like
parents' level of
restrict everything
education,
else.
religion, everything else, right? I could try and restrict everything else that I could think of and try to make them similar, even though it was a subject variable. So being a subject variable might be part of it, but there's something else going on here. Why they didn't try to control those things. I mean, I guess they could have tried to control some things. They could have tried to control men and women. They could try to control level of education. They could try to control some. They could. They didn't. But they kind of just let it be a free-for-all. Because what were they really interested in? Differences. But what was their very first goal? Their very first hypothesis. Do you remember? Let me zoom in on this puppy so you can see it. Their very first hypothesis. Zoom. I love the dot cam. Javier's trying to get it. Right here. Will there be significant differences in the percentages of participants who agree with each of the three statements regarding their preferred method of integrating prayer into counseling? So their very first question required that they keep their hands off, right? Because what they wanted to know first and foremost was, what are the proportions of people who fall into each of these categories? How prevalent are people who identify with option A, identify with option B, identify with option C? That's their very first question. And so they have their group of subjects. They had 109 total, 108 people ended up giving them enough data. And they let those people self-select into the different groups. And they just let everything else hang, right? They didn't control anything else about them. Now, they certainly could have. They could have tried to maybe control for some other things like age and level of education. And they could have tried to do that. They didn't. But the fact that they didn't means that all potential for causal claims is just completely out the window, right? There are so many ways that these three groups are different. Potentially, we don't know anything about these. All we know is that some of them fall into each category. So there is so little that they have controlled here that really we're just talking about being descriptive. Maybe having some kind of associations, some correlations, but causality, just no way. I mean, it's wide open in terms of these different groups. So they really wanted to know about the proportions. And if they had tried to control the proportion, try to make the samples the same size, or control other things, then they might have actually been influencing what category people were in, right? Because it could be that more women than men happen to be in a category, not just the naturally existing state of affairs. They tried to control the proportion of men and women in each category. That might have messed with the numbers. It could be that more older people than younger people would be in a particular group. If they tried to mess with that, it could influence the proportions. It could be that more white people than black people fall in a particular group. If they tried to mess with that, it could mess with the proportions. So if they want to get a true sense of who walks in the door and says, I go in option A, who walks in the door and says, I go in option B, who walks in the door and says, I go in option C. If they want to get the clearest picture that they can, well, as clear as they can, the true picture, then they keep their hands off. But they give up a lot of theoretical power when they do that, right? No causal claims, no true experiment. We're going to start running into issues with statistical validity too, right? Because we have samples of wildly different sizes. Tell me about how big is the group for option A? How many people fell into that group? Option A, praying with their counselor during a session. How many people were in that group? 9 out of 109 total people. 9 people fell in that group. 8%. What about people who fell into option B? 26 people, or 24%. Right? So about a quarter of the people fell in option B. And that leaves everybody else. Right? 70% of the people, or 73 actual individuals, 70% of the people said, I'm in option C. I don't want prayer integrated with my counseling at all. So we have these truly naturally existing categories, right? They're clearly pre-existing categories, but now they've answered their first question, which is, are there differences in the percentages? Now, when they did statistics to determine if these percentages were significant, what did they do? What statistic did they do to compare those percentages? Chi-square, right? They did a chi-square test for goodness of fit. Okay? And the reason that I like this article is because they show both the chi-square and the ANOVA, which are both good for cases where you have multiple categories. You can use them. You can use chi-square with 2 categories, but you can also use it with 3, 4, 5 categories. Chi-square is used when we're comparing proportions, or frequencies, or percentages. You learned about that in 3510, I think, right? Chi-square for goodness of fit. ANOVA is good for what? What do we compare when we use analysis of variance? Not proportions, frequencies, or percentages.
What's the critical region? So is it like 1 or?
Well, what do we do math on? What do we end up comparing in our post-hoc? All of them have conditions. What kind of numbers are we using? Not proportions, not frequencies, not percentages.
Absolute value.
Absolute value of what? What are we calculating absolute values of? Mean differences. ANOVAs are about means. ANOVAs are about means and standard deviations. And when t-tests, ANOVA, they're all about means and standard deviations, calculating means and standard deviations, and comparing the means and standard deviations for our different groups. So if what you're comparing among your groups are means, looking to see which mean is bigger than another or which mean is smaller than another, then you're talking about t-tests or analysis of variance. If you're talking about looking at different groups and comparing the frequencies or the proportions or the percentages, then you're talking about a chi-square. So in this study, they actually use both, because in one case, when they're just talking about this first question of are the proportions similar across the groups, do we see an equal proportion of people in each one of the 3 categories, they have to use a chi-square. Because there's no average. You can't take an average of people saying, I go in option A, and I go in option B, and I go in option C. What would you average? There's nothing to average. Each person just says, I go here. So there's no average. There's just frequencies. And so you can't run an ANOVA on those data. So instead, they take the independent variable, they look at the number of scores that are associated with each level of that variable, and they can perform a chi-square and compare the percentages for each level with the null hypothesis, which in this case was that there would be the same proportion in each category. That you would see 33.3% in each category, right? That there would be no difference among the proportions in each group. And in fact, they got significant difference. So that there was a significant difference in the proportion among the categories, with the smallest proportion being in option A, the largest proportion being in option C. So tell me now about the dependent variables for this study. They had 2 dependent variables, aside from discounted frequency. How were those measured? What were they and how were they measured?
Spirituality. With the
Spirituality was one, and how did they measure that?
With the ISS.
The ISS, the Intrinsic Spirituality Scale. How many questions were on that scale? 6. Okay, 6 questions. That doesn't seem like very many. They're going to assess someone's spirituality with 6 questions. Okay? I mean, but there are many surveys that have fewer questions than that, right? It's just a short scale trying to get a value to identify each person's spirituality. Okay? What was the other dependent variable?
Religious commitment.
Religious commitment. Okay, and how many questions were on that scale?
10.
10. Okay, a few more. Now, what's the difference between spirituality and religious commitment.
Well, spirituality doesn't necessarily need to like ascribe to a specific religion.
Okay, so spirituality doesn't necessarily have to ascribe to a specific religion. It could have to do with what? Not necessarily a particular God or a particular doctrine, particular commandments or rules, but it's more like what? How would you describe spirituality?
Higher power.
Maybe you believe in a higher power, or a connection between living things. Any other ideas? What other things would make something spiritual but not necessarily religious?
Nature.
Maybe the power of nature, that we could be connected to nature, right, as living creatures, or that there's energy that flows through the earth to us. Right? That could work.
Crystals.
Huh?
Crystals.
Crystals, maybe you believe, well, I mean, crystals or other kinds of artifacts could be part of a spiritual belief. They could also be part of a religious belief. And what's religious commitment, then? What was that about?
Daily effort to practice and fulfill the expectations of your religious or your doctrine.
Okay, so if you do ascribe to a particular religious faith, that faith will have expectations of how you're supposed to act, what you're supposed to do, how you're supposed to think as part of its doctrine, and the amount of effort you take to be consistent with those tenets. If your faith says you need to pray at certain times during the day, do you do it or not? If your faith says you need to treat other people a certain way, do you do it or not? If your faith says you shouldn't eat certain foods, do you do it or not? So the extent to which you endeavor to live your life in a way that's consistent with a preset faith and the doctrine connected to it. So they're looking at these two things. It's possible, for example, that someone could identify as agnostic, right? They say, I don't believe in any particular God, I don't have any particular religion, but they could be a spiritual person still. And it's possible that, so they're trying to separate out this idea of religion and belief, like what you believe versus how much do you live your life by a specific set of rules that are defined by your faith. So they have these two measures, both relatively short. And did they find, when they compared people on these measures, did they find significant differences when they looked at their scores? We're talking about 7 and 8 now. Did they find differences in their scores? Yes. They did. They found significant differences in their scores? Okay, so what did they find? What was the mean score on the ISS for people who identified with option A, or that's the I want prayer integrated into my therapy, with my therapist group? 7.56. Right, so highest score. What was the score for the people in the middle group? The people who said, I don't mind my therapist guiding me to pray outside of sessions. What was their mean? 5.82. And what about people who were in group C who said they didn't want prayer integrated with their therapy at all? 3.29. So they did find, so in answer to the second question, will there be significant differences in the mean scores of participant spirituality between participants who prefer to pray in sessions, those who prefer to be encouraged to pray outside of sessions, and those who prefer no prayer? The answer is yes. We did analysis of variance on those means, and we found that there was a significant difference. And what specifically was that difference? What did they find? Which group, to do our little 4-point description, who was the standout group? Which group was different from the others? Yeah. The researchers observed that those who wanted to pray with their counselor during therapy had significantly higher spirituality scores than the other two groups. And they also found that those who wanted to pray outside of their sessions had significantly higher spirituality scores than those who didn't want prayer at all. So this was a linear effect. Okay? Group A was significantly more than Group B and Group C, and Group B was significantly more than Group C. So if where you placed yourself seemed to have a good connection to how you scored on this scale. So people who had a lot of spirituality wanted to pray with their therapist. People who had a moderate amount of spirituality wanted to be guided in prayer outside of therapy, and people who had low spirituality scores didn't want prayer integrated with their therapy at all. Makes sense, right? Nothing too surprising here. Okay, so a linear, very linear effect. What about religious commitment? Did they find a statistically significant result here when they did an ANOVA on their religious commitment scores? We're looking at question number 3 now. Now we're talking about number 8. What was the average religious commitment score for people in option A? 34.56. Okay. What about for people in option B? 28.42. And for option C? Okay, so those are the means that we're comparing here. And they found a statistically significant result? Yes? Okay, with their ANOVA. And what was the specific pattern that they observed? Who was significantly different from the others? Was it the same? Is it the same pattern? Same pattern? Okay, so if we look at, let's take a look. Make sure we get this right. Showed. There were significant differences between option A and C as well as B and C, but no differences between A and B. I want to make sure that we didn't see differences all along. So we're talking about this paragraph right here. So they did post hoc tests. And so A was different from C, and B was different from C, but A was not different from B. Okay, so what that means is the standout group in this case was Group C. Group C is the only one that was different from the others. Okay, the people who did not want prayer integrated into their counseling had significantly lower religious commitment scores than the other two groups. And there was no difference in the religious commitment between people in A and B. So that pattern's a little bit different. For spirituality, we saw that all the groups were different from each other. But for religious commitment, the only group that was significantly different from the others was Group C. There was no difference between groups A and B. Okay, so tell me about this study in terms of the different types of validity. Let's think now that we have a sense of what was going on here. We're not even going to talk about the qualitative analysis because that's much more interpretive and it's not the focus of this course. We don't talk about qualitative analysis here, just quantitative stuff. We're number crunchers. So let's talk about construct validity, statistical validity, internal validity, external validity. First, let's talk about construct validity. What is construct validity? First, what is it? Okay, well that's validity in general, right? So are we measuring what we mean to measure? But specifically we're interested in instructions. We're interested in how well did they design their variables. Okay, so how well is the independent variable designed to do independent variable jobs? And how well is the dependent variable designed to do dependent variable jobs? And are we convinced that the independent variable really divides people up into the groups it says it divides them into? Are we really convinced that the dependent variables are measuring what they're supposed to measure? How do we feel about the instruments that they used? to measure these things? So do I think that the ISS was a good measure of spirituality? Do I think that the RCI-10 was a good measure of religious commitment? How convinced am I that these things that they say they're using, the variables, which are the core of their study, are actually what they say they are? They're really doing what they're supposed to do. So what do you guys think? Yeah.
I don't know if this relates to this, but I remember us talking about, because they did a questionnaire, and that's like a self-report.
Yeah, this is all self-report.
Like,
yeah.
If it's a self-report, then it's not 100% accurate.
Pretty much, because people lie to others and they lie to themselves.
So their claim wouldn't be as strong, right?
Absolutely. We're talking self-report stuff. People could say, especially if someone thinks they're supposed to be very religious, they might, on a survey like this, claim to have very high religious commitment. Oh yes, I do all the things that my God wants me to do, all the time. Except when I'm driving or it's inconvenient. Or whatever. Right? But they don't say that part. Right? So, you're absolutely right. The fact that this is all self-report stuff. Right? That makes us wonder a little bit about whether or not it's true. Okay, so that's a bit of a concern. We have to ask ourselves, how likely is someone to self-report inaccurately about where they fit on the independent variable? How likely is someone to report inaccurately or respond inaccurately on their spirituality or on their religious commitment? To the extent that we think people might be responding inaccurately, we have to be concerned about how they set this up. But is there any way to know for sure?
No.
I mean, there's no like concrete non-self-report way to find out about someone's religiosity unless you want to follow them around with a camera and count the number of times they do godly things.
That would be subjective.
And that would be subjective too, because how do you decide? Well, that seems like they're being really nice to that old person. What? Yeah, I mean, what does that mean? So that would be really challenging too. Okay. So, but you're totally right. Self-report measure makes me worry a little bit that that the things are squishy. Okay, definitely squishy. So, were the surveys that they used normed and standardized and evaluated to any degree?
The one that they use to measure prayer preferences and lead up to this.
Yeah, so the one that they use for prayer preference, right, the very first one, you can slip right into here. Under instrumentation, they very kindly gave us a whole section for this, right? So the one they use for prayer preference, they put it down here at the bottom. The PPCQ, and we gave it an acronym so it sounds important. The PPCQ was created for this study and reviewed by a panel of counseling psychologists for accuracy, efficiency, and proper wording. So at least they, had some other people look at it. They had some experts look at it to see if their 3 categories seemed like reasonable divisions. So that's a good thing, I guess. There were no norms, reliability, or validity data for this because this is the first time anybody's ever used it. Other reviewers who didn't know about what they were doing, who were mental health professionals, looked at it and said, yeah, this looks good. Maybe not the strongest instrument ever used, but then again, you're asking people basically one question. Which of the 3 categories do you go in? So it's also not, the most rigorous questionnaire either. And people should be able to say, maybe they don't know, but people should be able to identify with one of those categories and pick a category that they genuinely believe in. Do they? We don't know. All right, then we talk about the other 2. What about the ISS? Well, if I want to think about the construct validity of that scale, we can look about where it comes from, but what's really interesting to me is the stuff here about the norms, reliability, and validity. So how well tested is this scale of spirituality? Was it just created for this study, or has it actually been used in other cases, and have people attempted to determine whether or not it is an effective measure of spirituality? Now note, They changed this measure for this study because the original measure included references to religion, and they took all of those out so they could distinguish spirituality from religion. So they actually modified this for the purposes of their own study. But let's take a look at who. So it says it was developed and validated using a sample of university students, and that seems good because this test was also done on university students. So it should be a good measure for this population. Great, okay. The norm group was 67% women and 33% men and 69% white. Okay? Tell me about the population that was in this study. How much does that look like the population that was in this study? Pretty similar. This study had 60% women, I think. And what else? What proportion were white? 76%. Lots of white people. Okay. So that looks pretty similar. Okay. So at least this survey has been tested on a population that looks similar to this group. Okay, before. But who is it tested on? A primarily Christian sample. Okay. Now, does that describe our population? Was this population primarily Christian that they worked with?
No.
Okay. So what proportion of people in this study identified as Christian?
46.8.
So we had 47%. Okay. So almost half. Okay. Now, how much, now I don't know the answer to this question, and I don't see anything about this in here. Do we have a sense, or do you think the researchers had a sense, of the extent to which prayer is important to Christians and how that might be different from the degree to which prayer is important to people of other faiths? Do we know, for example, that people in all faiths pray? Do you know if Hindus pray? Or the role that prayer plays in Hinduism? Do you know if Buddhists pray? And the role that prayer plays in their life? Maybe it could be in different religious faiths, prayer has a different role. And while prayer might be something you do with others, in some faiths it might be something that's intensely private in others and that you would never share with somebody else. Right? I don't know. I can imagine lots of different ways that prayer might be integrated into a religious belief system. Now this was normed on Christians, I think, with the idea that, Christian spirituality is like all other kinds of spirituality, but it's possible that it's not. Right? Spirituality could vary for different groups of people. So the fact that this was tested and validated primarily on Christians could potentially be an issue. It has, it's, they're testing it on Christians. So for Christians it might be good, but I don't know the extent to which, you're talking about a third of the people in this study said that they were atheist or agnostic. How do you know that their spirituality is going to be the same as people who are religious? You don't. So this might be a fine measure of spirituality for a group of Christians, but it's not clear that it's a fine measure of spirituality for a group that's more diverse and people of a wider variety of faiths. We don't know that. Okay. Now let's look at religious commitment. How is the measure of religious commitment? Again, we're going to look down here at the norms, reliability, and validity. It says it was normed on students and individuals in the community from various religious affiliations, as well as therapists and clients in both secular and explicitly Christian counseling agencies. How does that sound? Better, worse, the same? So the religious commitment has been evaluated on people of a wide variety of faiths. It's been evaluated on people who are attending counseling in both secular settings, like if you happen to go to the University Counseling Center, or in specifically Christian settings like a Christian therapy center or going to see your minister or your priest or something like that. So how do you feel about this measure? It seems a little bit better because it's been used on a wider variety of people before. So I feel a little bit better about this measure because the population we're talking about in this study, a variety of different faiths, including people who don't identify with any faith. So some secular, some religious. This measure seems to be a bit better designed, okay, and better tested, more valid. We see that they've done retest reliability, so they've given the same measure to people multiple times and gotten similar scores, suggesting that people's responses are pretty consistent on it, which is good. People don't lie on it or change their answers. That's good. So there are more statistics on it too. So I think probably the best measure they've got here in terms of that validity is this religious commitment one. It's been evaluated most thoughtfully and used the most often. So if we think about all those things, how would you evaluate the construct validity of this study? What do you think? Is it really high? No. Medium. I mean, it's okay. Last class, I think we came to the very specific conclusion of it's all right. But we're not like, yay, this is fabulous. There are things that we could probably think of to do to make it stronger, right? To make sure that the validity of the variables, the way they're designed, the way we're manipulating or measuring what we're interested in, we might be able to make it stronger by either testing the measures more to make sure they're really telling us what we think they're telling us, testing them on a wider variety of people. That would probably be helpful to improve the construct validity of the study. But we're inherently looking at a smushy topic, right? I mean, how religious are you? Well, how do you decide that? How spiritual are you? There's no specific scale for that. So we're just, we're trying to put numbers on an inherently subjective thing. So it's going to, the construct validity is going to be lower. Okay, so that's construct validity. What about statistical validity? Tell me what statistical validity is, and then tell me what you think about the statistical validity of this study. What's statistical validity? Yes?
How well the results match up with what was said in the hypothesis?
Okay, that's part of it. So we're looking to see if, when we talk about statistical validity, remember that we're thinking about type 1 and type 2 error. Remember that? What's type 1 error? I know, we're reaching back. Rejecting the null falsely, right? So it's finding a significant difference where you shouldn't, right? That's a false alarm. That would be type 1 error. Type 2 error is
Not finding a significant difference when you should.
that's right, a miss, right? Not finding a significant difference when you should. So statistical validity is all about, to what extent do I believe the results of this study, the statistical outcomes that they report, are correct and don't represent type 1 error every time they find a significant difference, or type 2 error every time they find no difference. So to what extent do I believe their results are accurate statistically and free of type 1 or type 2 error? So if we're thinking about that, think back to the last article we read. Remember, we had some concerns about the statistical validity of that study because of the differences in the sample size. The sample size for women was like 2 or 3 times as big as the sample size for men. And we were worried about that because sample size affects the power of a statistic, right? Bigger samples make it easier to find smaller effects. Bigger samples make it easier to find smaller effects. We go back to our discussion of effect size. It's like, remember, if you just have 2 or 3 cats running along the beach, you might miss them. But if there's 1,000 cats running along the beach, you're not going to miss it, right? Even though they're small. So the bigger the sample is, the easier it is to get statistical significance even when the treatment effect is small. Well, in this case, the samples are really different in size, right? The sample for group C is 70% of the subjects. And the sample for group A is what, like 8% of the subjects. And the sample for group B is like 24% of the subjects, right? So we've got really different sample sizes here. Really different. That means that whatever effects they're observing for group C, I trust those more than the ones for group A. Because group A is really, really small. Group A, I don't even think has 10 people in it. Group A only has 9 people in it. Not even 10. Compare that to 26 people and 73 people. That means that the statistical power for each of these groups is very different. And that it's much easier to find significant results for the big group than it is to find them for the small group. And one way to think about whether or not we got some weird results is to take a look at the effect size for the different results. Looking for eta squared or r squared or Cohen's d, something like that. There's a problem. What's the problem? Go look at those ANOVA reports. Go look at the ANOVAs. Tell me what the effect size is. Here, I'm looking at some ANOVAs. There's an ANOVA. There's a lovely one right there. Tell me about that effect size. Oh, look, here's a chi-square up here. Tell me about that effect size. There's another one down here.
They didn't run a test.
They don't report their effect sizes. They might not have even calculated them. So we have no idea what the treatment effect sizes are here. That makes it really hard for us to determine statistical validity well. If you think about the last study we read, we saw that there were cases where, for the sample of men, they had a medium treatment effect size and still didn't get significance because the sample was so small. And that sample was still bigger than their 9 in this case. So it's entirely possible that they found no significant effects, like no significant difference between group A and group B in terms of religious commitment. That null effect right there could represent type 2 error. There might actually be a difference between those two groups in their religious commitment, but we just couldn't see it because the samples were so small. Now it's much harder to get a false positive. Yeah.
So if you have like a study set up like this where all the groups are this different in terms of size and it's very hard to determine statistical validity, why would you continue in the study the way you have it designed? Why wouldn't you adjust it and then?
Well, we can't change the sample sizes because that's part of what they were interested in was how different are the groups.
Well, yeah, that is important. But once you get to this point and you're like, wow, we can't really get statistical validity because of all of these different factors, why wouldn't they change the way they're running the study and kind of change some of their hypotheses? So that, I feel like I want to publish something more.
Well, I mean, they got statistical significance.
Okay.
So there are, and the differences that they observed seem reasonable. I mean, the patterns of results aren't surprising. It's not surprising to me that people who are in group A, that strong prayer group, have high spiritual scores and high religious commitment scores. That doesn't surprise me.
You don't even need a study to determine. I mean, you can kind of assume that.
No, but you can't, because we're scientists. We need the data. So now it's published, so now it's documented. They've tried to be rigorous to the extent they can be rigorous. That doesn't mean that we might not want to do the study differently to ask that question. For example, once we had identified the fact that in the real, in the real world, these groups are of very different sizes, you might then do a follow-up study where you try to get the same number of people for each group and try to control for other factors and then do the comparison for the knower. It doesn't mean we couldn't do it better, but this is a place to start. Right? Remember, this is a descriptive study. They're not trying to establish cause. So they're willing to have the data be a lot smushier. But you're right, this isn't as compelling as something that's like a true experiment with a manipulated variable, and you can see that. Right? But there's a lot of data in psychology like this. And that's why we talk about evaluating it in terms of different types of validity, because you have to look at the study and go, okay, yeah, that's interesting, but I want you to imagine. Can you imagine someone published it? It's scientifically proven that, right? It's in a paper, right? So people are going to start acting like this makes it somehow, makes something true that wasn't documented as true before. And that's not true either. That's why we look at the validity. So that we can say, well, let's think about this. I mean, in terms of the construct validity, it's okay. In terms of the statistical validity, I don't know. They don't report effect sizes. So I'm a little bit concerned that some of the null results might be type 2 error, but I can't really tell. The sample sizes are really different, so we have really different statistical power across the group, so that might be giving us some negative, give us some type 2 error where we would otherwise actually get a statistically significant result. So again, I'm kind of feeling like, it's all right. It's not horrible, but it's not, I don't think it has strong statistical validity either. And that's, when you look at this, I want you to see how different it is from other kinds of studies where things are much more clear and you can actually feel like there's a clear causal relationship. So why? Because this data is important too. It's a place to start. But you're absolutely right. It's very small. Now, internal validity. We already said, we can't assess the internal validity of this study at all. Because this is not a true experiment. There are so many potential confounds here. So many things that were not controlled, so many extraneous variables, that we can't even evaluate the internal validity of this study. It's not a relevant kind of validity to even look at. So that leaves us with external validity. That's our last one. So far we've got, the construct validity is okay, the statistical validity is okay. Now let's think about the external validity. So let's look at who was in the study and think about how this group may or may not reflect people who go to therapy, people who need therapy. So these are people who are going to the University of Arizona State. They went to the University Counseling Center. So already, what do we know about them?
In one small geographic area.
Okay, so they're from the West, right? Or they're going to school in the West. They're going to school at Arizona State. So these are people who can and do go to a state university in the West, right? Look at their ages. Their age range was from 18 to 39. Average age 23. So that's the average student is non-traditional, right? 23 would be a little bit older. Okay, but 56% were in that traditional age range, 18 to 22. So we know these are people who are going to college at a university, that the majority of them are between the ages of 18 and 22 with an average age of 23. So these are relatively young people. 64% are women, with the remainder being men. Most participants have been in counseling before, the majority. Okay. So just stop for a second and think about how does that compare so far to, say, Georgia State University? Here's a different state university in a different part of the country. Does that seem like it would match up with us? If we were to replicate this study here, in terms of those characteristics, how might Georgia State look different? Or how might universities in other parts of the country look different in terms of those proportions? We haven't got that part. We're just talking about this part. We're going to get to the ethnic part in a second. Age, okay. You think it looks different than Georgia State?
I'm saying, is that what you were asking about?
Yeah, we're talking just about these characteristics so far.
The age might be different here.
I don't know what our average age should be.
Well, what's your intuition? What do you think? Is Georgia State, and I know when I first came here 15 years ago, we had a lot more non-traditional students, lots of commuter students. There were no dorms, or the dorms that we had were on the Georgia Tech campus because we had the old Olympic Village. Those were the only dorms. People who lived in the dorms got bussed in. That was it. No fraternity, sorority row, none of that. It was, where the teaching building used to be the jail, the county jail. You get to walk by the jailhouse every day. If you got off of MARTA, you had to walk by the jail to get to campus. I like the big signs. Yeah, I know. It's like, get to school, don't go to jail. If you don't go there, you're going here. Get to class. Right? Okay. So, yeah, but let me cover that down. All right. So, yeah, now we have this great science and teaching building. Priorities have changed downtown a little bit. But now, does this seem, if you think about the proportion of men and women, what do you think?
More women in college?
There are. Well, they're saying they're about 60%, 40%. So it's actually more common. We have more women going to college now than men, proportion.
But you can apply that to like Georgia Tech, because Georgia Tech's like 70% men.
That's right. So it's going to depend on the kind of school you're talking about, right? So this is not going to apply, it might not apply to engineering schools where you get a higher proportion of men, right? So it's going to depend on the kind of university you're talking about, right? But still you're talking about people who are going to college, right? And how many people actually get to go to college?
Not many.
What proportion of people actually get to go and finish a college degree? I know the proportion that actually finish a PhD, 1.5%.
Oh my gosh.
So, yeah, and it's weird because I live in a world where lots of people have them, and it's like, it can't be that low. Oh yes, we're freaks. All right, so let's take a look at, let's look at them ethnically. That might be a little bit easier. So it says, ethnically the sample comprised of 76% white, 19% Hispanic, about 5% Asian or Asian American, 3% African American, 1% American Indian, and 2% other. Now, how does that fit with Georgia State?
Not at all.
76% white?
Well, I went to college in Seattle and it looked like that before I transferred here. I think
In the West, I think those might be more representative.
Yeah.
Well, you start moving over to the East Coast and down in the South. Heck no, it doesn't look like that. Our school is what? We have 40% white, 40% black, and 30% all other kind. I mean, this is I think the 14th or 15th most ethnically diverse campus in the country. We're ranked up there with places like Stanford and Berkeley and stuff in terms of our racial and ethnic diversity. This is not an ethnically diverse sample. And in fact, many of the people who identify as Latino might also identify as white, right? Because when you're Latino, you can identify as white or black, right? So, this is in terms of race and ethnicity, quite different from what we would expect. And if we want to take this and compare it to schools like, what about Spelman or Morehouse? And now I want you to think about that proportion. Okay, think about those proportions. And now think about the role that religion and spirituality play in the lives of people from different racial and ethnic groups. Are there differences? Yes, no? I hear silence.
Yeah.
There's differences, right? So if you're talking to people who are mostly white and about half Christian, and a third agnostic or atheist, Do you think those results are going to generalize to? I mean, what if we went to Spelman or Morehouse? How do you think that the reports from students on those campuses would differ? Where do you think their religiosity scores would be? Would they be higher or lower?
Higher.
What about their spirituality scores? Higher or lower? I would actually guess higher. So, and if you went to, if you talked to students who were going to Spelman or Morehouse and you asked them, how do you feel about prayer being integrated into your counseling? What do you think they would say? Do you think they would look like these people?
No.
Maybe, maybe not. But given the powerful presence of Christianity and Islam in the African American community, I would guess that you would see very different, you would see much higher scores. I don't think the proportions would be this. I don't think you'd find so many people in Group C. Do you?
No.
So we think about how well these findings generalize, and you think about who would be served by this information. How do we feel about the external validity here? I mean, how well do you think these findings generalize to even Americans? Or who do they generalize to?
Well, it's all students.
College students?
College students, so it doesn't seem that generalized a little bit. I mean, generations have very different opinions on religion.
Oh yeah, the age here, think about that. What about, think about your parents or your grandparents. Do they have, were they or are they more religious than you? I tell you, my grandma ever went to therapy, she would have had a Bible in her handbag. This was on the coffee table at her house, you walk in the door, and that was the big old Bible that had been in her family, the one with the writing in the back where every generation of weddings and babies and everything else had been written in the back. That sat on her coffee table. And as the oldest of 12 kids, she was the keeper of that family Bible, and that was a big deal. And now I'm just kind of like, I don't carry a Bible in my backpack. I wouldn't think about carrying a Bible in my backpack. My grandma probably never left the house without one somewhere close by. So if we think about this, we're talking about young generation and how they might feel about having prayer integrated with their therapy. What about older clients? Do you think this is going to reflect them? I would also bet that if we looked at older populations, we would find more people in Group A and Group B, and fewer people in Group C. So, again, I ask you, what do you think about the external validity of this study?
Terrible.
Terrible! Oh, you're just trying to be like,
Not the best.
it's. So this whole study, if I think about this study, it's all kind of, it's okay for what it's trying to do, but, I could think of a lot of ways I could make the external validity of this study better, right? Broader age ranges, broader categories of race and ethnicity, making sure there was more balance so we're getting a better sense of, parts of the country. Yeah?
And also if you're dealing with people who, the majority that have been in counseling before, you might have an issue of them wanting it to continue as follow a model of counseling.
That's true. So they might already have a way that they want to do it and a way that works for them, and so they want it to stay that way. And if they've been attending getting secular care, then changing it and integrating religion into it may feel like it's not real scientific therapy or something like that.
Or vice versa.
Or vice versa, right. Exactly. Or vice versa. Yeah. So it seems like what this study is really good for is giving us a place to start. And certainly they're asking some interesting questions, but there are a lot of things that even we as novice researchers could see that could be done to improve the study and make it more effective, making the outcome more broadly useful. Yeah.
Would it also be a proof to external validity that they grouped anyone who claimed as Christian into all denominations into one?
Oh yeah, well, and then did that for all different versions of every faith, right? It's like, whites, because we all know all white people are the same, or blacks, because all black people are the same, or Asians, because there's no difference among Asian people, they're all exactly the same. or what, I mean, saying that all Native American groups are the same. Yeah, they're grouping people, and you think about differences between, Unitarian Universalists who may not even want to, be specific about the gender of God, and then you get, like, people up here who are fire and brimstone and kissing snakes. Right? I mean, there's a pretty big span of people in Christianity, right, in terms of, what does it mean to be compliant with my faith's doctrines, right? Some people would say that, people down here who say, I'm being really compliant. People up here would go, I don't even recognize you as a Christian. I mean, I have family members who are like, Mormonism is a cult. And I'm like, what are you talking about? It's a religion. No, it's not. They're not really Christians. I'm like, have you asked them about that? And it's kind of like, so, yeah, Christianity is a very broad thing. Most major faiths have a lot of different identities in them, and treating them all like they're all going to feel the same way about prayer and the role of prayer and all that is probably also not a good thing. So there's certainly a lot we could do to improve this, but this is a place to start and something to build on, even though in terms of the different types of validity, I would say that it's relatively weak. But the good thing is that you can see those weaknesses. So when you see something that isn't weak like that, you'll know. Right? And as we look at more studies, you're going to say, oh, okay, that's better. I feel more like that's a better measure. And that's what you need when you're reading science. You have to be able to make those judgment calls to decide how much weight you want to put on that outcome. Does anybody have any other questions? Yeah.
There's something like about with the ISS hypothesis, and they said that they didn't assume homogeneity of variance.
Right.
And then the religious commitment one, they said that they did assume it, and they did assume it.
Yeah, and I don't know how they decided. This does have homogeneity of variance, and this doesn't. And
they didn't do any testing.
They don't provide any data to support those claims. Yeah, so I'd be like, oh really? So you just decided that you're going to use two-piece tests here. Well, that's nice. Based on what?
So there was nothing. I wasn't like missing anything.
No, it does seem a bit anomalous that they assume, and they don't explain why. They just say it, and it's like, oh, that's fine. And it's like, really? Why is that fine? So I agree. It's also it makes me concerned about their statistics, because it's like you can't just decide that they're homogeneous for one test and not for another, like based on what? All right, let me give you some info about the test, which you will want to know. Right, first thing you want to know about the test. Half of you are going to be asked to do an independent group SANOVA. The other half are going to be asked to do a related group SANOVA. You don't know which one you're going to get. But I'm not going to make you do one of each because it would take you way too long. There's a lot of calculations. Okay? So many of the calculations are similar. And I've modified the number of calculations for the two tests so that everybody's doing the same number of calculations. Okay, but for most of the tests, the calculations are basically the same, right, for both of them. There are a few differences there in the middle, and that's about it. Okay. You need to know how to calculate Fmax. You need to know